On the edge of the American continent, where the silver strand meets the black water, stands a castle made of wood and hubris, the Hotel del Coronado, queen and extravagance rising from the shifting sand. 33 acres of white-clapboard and blood-red shingles, a labyrinth of turrets and verandas designed to disorient the wind. 700 rooms of electric light and gilded luxury. It was built as a fortress of leisure, a sanctuary for the wealthy to escape the grime of the industrial world. But the problem with a fortress is that once the gates are locked, it becomes a prison. The Pacific Ocean does not bargain with the land it borders, it simply tolerates the intrusion until the tide decides otherwise, and here at the edge of the continent, where the silver strand of Coronado bleeds into the cold, turbulent water, stands a monument to human defiance, known as the Hotel del Coronado. It is a structure that defies the logic of its environment, a sprawling wooden castle of queen and architecture painted in stark white and roofed in a red that mimics the color of dried blood under the setting sun. To view the hotel from the beach at twilight is to witness a grand illusion where the turrets and cupolas seem to float against the darkening sky, detached from the reality of the sand and salt spray that gnaws at its foundations. The air here tastes of brine and old cedar, a sensory reminder that this grand dame of the Victorian era is organic and decaying despite the layers of paint and the endless renovations that seek to preserve the fantasy of eternal leisure. It is a place built on the premise of escape, where the wealthy and the powerful fled the grime of industrial cities to breathe the restorative air of the West. Yet, for all its architectural whimsy and manicured gardens, the hotel serves as a gilded cage where the past is not only remembered, it is imprisoned. In the winter of 1892, the hotel was young, a fresh scar on the landscape of San Diego, but it had already begun to accumulate the weight of secrets that would define its legacy for more than a century. The narrative of the Hotel del Coronado is often told through the lens of celebrity and grandeur, listing the presidents and princes who have walked its polished hallways, but the true heart of this structure beats with a rhythm of tragedy. We begin our investigation not with the fanfare of the hotel's opening, nor with the electric brilliance of its chandelier-filled dining room, but with a solitary figure standing on a windswept veranda looking out at a black ocean that offered no answers. The story of Kate Morgan is the story of the hotel itself, a beautiful facade hiding a dark and fractured reality, and to understand why she died on those stone steps, we must first understand the machine that lured her there. This is not merely a ghost story, it is an autopsy of the Gilded Age, a period where the surface was gold but the interior was rotting, and nowhere is this dichotomy more palpable than in the hallways of the Del, where the silence is heavy with the things that guests are too polite to say. The vision for the Hotel del Coronado was born from the hubris of two men, Elisha Babcock and Hampton L. Story, who looked upon a barren spit of sand covered in jackrabbits and scrub brush and saw the potential for the greatest resort the world had ever known. Their ambition was not merely financial, it was a psychological need to conquer the emptiness of the West, to impose order and luxury upon a landscape that was inherently hostile to such softness. In the late 1880s, the construction of the hotel was a logistical nightmare, a feat of engineering that required the importation of labor and materials on a scale that baffled the local population. They did not hire a traditional architect, but rather sketched their dreams on pieces of paper, handing them to carpenters and engineers who were tasked with translating these fevered dreams into structural reality, resulting in a building that feels improvised and organic rather than rigidly planned. The timber was shipped from the forests of the north, vast quantities of redwood and pine that were bled of their sap and hammered into the skeleton of a resort that was designed to burn brightly and briefly. The paradox of the construction lies in its fragility, as this massive wooden structure was built in a place of wind and fire, a gamble against nature that required constant vigilance and maintenance. As the walls went up, the builders incorporated the latest technology of the day, including one of the largest electrical power plants in the region, overseen by Thomas Edison's own company, which turned the hotel into a beacon of artificial light visible for miles at sea. This technological marvel was a double-edged sword, for while it provided the illusion of safety and modernity, it also created a hum of machinery that permeated the wooden bones of the hotel, a constant low-frequency vibration that some sensitive guests claimed disturbed their sleep. The hotel was a living organism, a machine designed to process the desires of the rich and churn out profit, yet in its creation Babcock and Story had inadvertently built a labyrinth. The layout of the hotel is confusing, with corridors that twist and turn without logic, staircases that lead to nowhere, and rooms that vary wildly in size and shape, creating a sense of disorientation that can be charming in the daylight but deeply unsettling after dark. It was into this architectural puzzle that the guests of the 1890s arrived, bringing with them their steamer trunks, their servants, and their hidden desperate needs for validation and belonging. When the Hotel del Coronado opened its doors, it was marketed as a paradise, a playground for the elite where the rules of normal society were suspended in favor of leisure and excess, but beneath the surface of balls and beach parties, the hotel operated with the ruthless efficiency of a factory. The staff who maintained this illusion were the invisible army, an underclass of laborers, who lived in the bowels of the resort or in shanties nearby, ensuring that the linens were crisp and the silver was polished while they themselves remained unseen. This downstairs reality stands in stark contrast to the upstairs fantasy, creating a friction that vibrates through the history of the building. The guests who checked in were often escaping something, be it the boredom of their marriages, the scandals of their business dealings, or the simple crushing weight of societal expectation. In this context, the hotel was not a home but a stage set where everyone was playing a character and the stakes were nothing less than social survival. The year 1892 was a time of economic uncertainty and shifting social mores, a period where the rigidity of the Victorian era was beginning to crack under the pressure of modernity, and women in particular were navigating a treacherous landscape of limited options. A woman traveling alone was an anomaly, a figure of suspicion and curiosity, and her presence in a luxury hotel was often interpreted as a sign of either immense wealth or moral looseness. The atmosphere of the hotel in November of that year was one of winding down as the frantic energy of the summer season gave way to the more melancholy rhythms of the autumn off-season, where the fog rolled in thicker and the guests were fewer and more introspective. It was during this quiet lull that the tragedy began to take shape, not with a scream but with the scratch of a pen in a leather-bound registry book. The vast dining room with its crown-like ceiling sat partially empty, the sound of silverware clinking on china echoing a little too loudly in the cavernous space, emphasizing the isolation of those who dined alone. The corridors stretched out like tunnels into the past, lit by the flickering glow of the early electric bulbs, which cast long dancing shadows that seemed to anticipate the arrival of a tragedy. On Thanksgiving Day in 1892, a train arrived at the station, bringing with it a passenger who would become the most famous resident of the Hotel del Coronado, though not for the reasons she likely hoped. The woman who stepped onto the platform was described by witnesses as beautiful but weary, her face marked by a pallor that suggested illness or deep emotional distress, and her eyes scanning the crowd for a face that was not there. She wore a black dress, a garment that was both practical for travel and symbolic of the mourning, that she seemed to carry with her an external manifestation of an internal grief. She carried no luggage save for a small handbag, a detail that immediately raised eyebrows among the porters and staff, for a woman of her apparent class would typically travel with trunks full of clothing for the various social obligations of a hotel stay. She identified herself as Lottie A. Bernard, a name that sounded elegant but generic, a pseudonym that was the first layer of defense in the mystery she was constructing around herself. As she took the carriage ride from the station to the hotel, the imposing red and white structure loomed ahead like a fortress, and one can only imagine the mixture of hope and dread she felt as she approached the place where she intended to resolve her fate. The check-in process was a performance where she feigned a confidence she likely did not feel, explaining away her lack of luggage with a story about a brother who would soon arrive with her trunks and her ticket. The clerk behind the desk, a man trained to assess the creditworthiness and social standing of guests in a single glance, was skeptical, but the hotel was not full and the woman had money, so he handed her the key to room 302. This room, located on the third floor, was not a grand suite but a modest accommodation meant for a single traveler, situated in a way that offered a view of the ocean but also a sense of detachment from the main flow of hotel life. As she walked up the grand staircase, her hand trailing on the polished mahogany railing, she was crossing a threshold from the world of the living into the realm of legend. The hotel swallowed her up, its wooden walls absorbing the sound of her footsteps, and the heavy silence of the room that awaited her became the first accomplice in her death. Room 302 was a space defined by its limitations, a square box of floral wallpaper and heavy drapes that smelled of dust and sea air, designed to comfort the traveler, but which quickly became a cell for the woman calling herself Lottie. Once inside, she did not unpack, for she had nothing to unpack. Instead, she paced the floorboards, wearing a track into the carpet, as she waited for the man she claimed was her brother, but whom history suspects was a lover or a husband. The room itself seemed to amplify her anxiety, the electric light buzzing with a frantic energy that matched her own internal turmoil, while the window offered a taunting view of the freedom she could not grasp. She complained of neuralgia, a catch-all term in the Victorian era for a variety of pains often associated with nerves or stress, and she requested whiskey and quinine from the hotel staff, remedies that would numb the body but do nothing to soothe the mind. The maids who entered the room to change the sheets or bring fresh water reported that the woman was erratic, oscillating between periods of intense lethargy, where she would lie on the bed fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, and moments of manic energy, where she would scrutinize her reflection in the mirror, as if searching for a flaw in her disguise. The furniture in the room, the heavy wooden wardrobe, the writing desk, the iron bed frame became the silent witnesses to her deterioration, absorbing the psychic energy of her despair. She was trapped in a feedback loop of waiting and disappointment, every footstep in the hallway causing her to freeze and hold her breath, hoping for a knock that never came. The hotel around her continued its daily rhythm of meals and leisure, the sounds of laughter and music drifting up from the ballroom serving as a cruel counterpoint to her solitary vigil. In the silence of room 302, the architecture of the hotel pressed in on her, the weight of the timber and the plaster feeling suffocating, and it is here in this claustrophobic environment that the decision to end the waiting began to form, not as a sudden impulse but as a logical conclusion to a situation that had become unbearable. The interactions between the woman known as Lottie and the hotel staff provide the primary texture of her final days, a series of fragmented conversations that reveal a mind on the brink of collapse. The head housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Anderson, noted the strange guest's behavior with a mixture of professional concern and personal suspicion, observing that Lottie seemed terrified of being recognized yet desperate for connection. Lottie would engage the maids in conversation, asking questions about the other guests, probing for information about who had checked in, all while maintaining the fiction of the missing brother. These conversations were a dance of deception where Lottie tried to maintain the facade of a respectable woman inconvenienced by travel logistics, while the staff saw through the cracks to the frightened girl beneath. She spoke of her luggage being lost, of the inefficiency of the railroads, of the unreliability of men, but her eyes betrayed a deeper terror, a fear that she had been abandoned completely. The staff, representing the invisible machine of the hotel, treated her with the distant politeness required of their station, but in the servant quarters they gossiped about the woman in 302, speculating on her origins and her fate. Was she a runaway wife? A mistress cast aside? A con artist? The theories swirled through the back hallways, mixing with the steam of the laundry and the heat of the kitchens, creating a mythology around her before she was even dead. One particularly telling incident involved a bellboy who brought her fresh towels and found her weeping by the window, a breach of Victorian composure that shocked the young man and sent him scurrying back to the safety of the lobby. She seemed to be looking for a savior, someone to intervene in the trajectory of her life, but the rigid class structures of the hotel prevented any real intimacy or assistance. The staff were there to serve, not to save, and so they watched her decline with a detachment that seems cruel in retrospect but was merely the professional standard of the time. The hotel demanded order, and Lottie was an element of chaos, a disruption that needed to be managed until she either paid her bill or left the premises. As the days turned into a week, the waiting game became a torture that Lottie could no longer endure, and the passive act of sitting in her room gave way to a need for action. She took the ferry across the bay to San Diego, a journey that reversed her arrival, moving from the isolation of the island back to the bustling reality of the city. The contrast between the silent luxury of the hotel and the gritty noise of the city streets must have been jarring, a sensory overload that perhaps clarified her intentions. She visited a gunsmith, a shop smelling of oil and cold metal, where she purchased a .44 caliber American Bulldog revolver, a weapon that was large, powerful, and utterly unsuited for a woman's handbag. The clerk would later testify that she seemed calm, almost businesslike, as she selected the weapon, claiming she needed it for protection because she traveled alone and had been nervous about the rough characters she encountered. It was a lie that was easily swallowed in the Wild West atmosphere of the time, where self-defense was a valid concern, but the choice of such a heavy-caliber weapon suggests a desire for certainty rather than mere protection. She also bought ammunition, the brass cartridges heavy in her hand, a physical weight that grounded her in the reality of what she was planning. The return trip on the ferry was a crossing of the River Styx, where she sat on the bench clutching the parcel that contained her death, watching the red roof of the hotel grow larger on the horizon. The building was no longer a sanctuary, it was a destination, a final coordinate on the map of her life. Upon returning to the hotel, she did not go to her room immediately but wandered the grounds, the gun heavy in her pocket, her presence like a ghost haunting the manicured lawns before the actual haunting began. She was arming herself against the silence, against the rejection, against the future, and the gun was the only object in her possession that offered her any control. The acquisition of the weapon marks the turning point, the moment where hope was abandoned and replaced by a grim resolve. The weather on the night of November 28th turned foul, a storm brewing off the coast that matched the internal tempest of the woman in room 302. The wind whipped around the turrets of the hotel, whistling through the gaps in the window frames and causing the gas lamps in the corridors to flicker, creating an atmosphere of gothic dread that was almost theatrical in its intensity. The ocean churned violently, the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks audible even within the thick walls of the hotel, a rhythmic pounding that sounded like a giant heart failing. Lottie spent the evening in her room, the storm outside mirroring the chaos in her mind, and one can imagine her sitting on the edge of the bed, the revolver sitting on the nightstand next to the bottle of quinine. She was arguably at the nadir of human loneliness, surrounded by luxury but bereft of comfort, waiting for a man who had clearly chosen not to come. The hotel staff saw her briefly in the hallway, her face pale, and set her eyes dark circles of exhaustion, and she moved with the stiffness of a marionette whose strings were being cut one by one. She did not dine that evening, the thought of food likely repellent, and instead she consumed the silence of the room, letting it fill her up until there was no room left for hope. The storm brought with it a drop in temperature, a damp chill that seeped into the bones of the building, making the timber creak and groan as if the hotel itself were in pain. It was a night for staying indoors, for huddling by the fire, for seeking the company of others, but Lottie prepared to go out into the rain. She dressed in her black traveling gown, the same one she had arrived in, closing the circle of her journey. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, not for warmth but perhaps for a sense of containment, and stepped out of her room, leaving the key on the table, a final gesture of checking out. The hallway was empty, the guests retreated to their rooms or the parlors, and she walked alone down the grand staircase, her hand brushing the banister for the last time, moving towards the exit that led to the beach. The discovery of the body the next morning was a moment that shattered the curated tranquility of the Hotel del Coronado. It was an electrician, a man named David Cohn, who found her his early morning rounds taking him along the exterior staircase that led down to the beach, where the gray light of dawn revealed a dark shape slumped on the steps. The storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and cold, and the rain had washed the steps clean of dust, but it had not washed away the tragedy. Lottie lay with her head resting on her right arm, almost as if she were sleeping, but the pool of blood and the gun lying near her hand told a different story. The shock of the discovery sent a ripple of panic through the hotel staff, who were trained to deal with lost luggage and cold soup, not violent death on the premises. The management's immediate priority was discretion, to shield the other guests from the grisly reality and to protect the reputation of the resort. Blankets were brought to cover the body, and the local authorities were summoned, but in the time it took for the coroner to arrive, the scene was compromised by the curiosity of the staff and the elements. The placement of the body on the stairs was peculiar. She was not secluded in her room, nor was she on the beach, but rather caught in the liminal space between the hotel and the ocean, a threshold she had failed to cross. The gun, a massive object for her small hand, lay nearby, and the bullet wound was in her temple, a classic sign of suicide or an execution. As the sun rose higher, illuminating the red roof of the hotel, the contrast between the beauty of the setting and the horror of the corpse became a grotesque tableau. The guests, waking up to their breakfast of eggs and coffee, were unaware that a woman lay dead just yards away. Her life ended in a violent punctuation mark that would stain the history of the hotel forever. The finding of the body was the catalyst that transformed Lottie Bernard from a troublesome guest into a mystery, converting the mundane sadness of her stay into a sensational event that would be consumed by the press and the public. The police investigation that followed was typical of the era, hasty, rudimentary, and driven by a desire to close the case quickly rather than to uncover the nuanced truth. The San Diego coroner arrived and conducted a preliminary examination on the steps, concluding almost immediately that the death was a suicide based on the presence of the gun and the nature of the wound. The concept of forensics was in its infancy, and there was no yellow tape, no careful grid search for fibers or footprints, merely a group of men in coats standing over a dead woman and nodding in agreement that she had done this to herself. The narrative of the melancholy woman was a powerful trope in Victorian society, and Lottie fit the description perfectly, making suicide the path of least resistance for the investigators. They did not question why a woman with a right-handed wound would be found in a position that suggested awkward geometry, nor did they deeply investigate the possibility of a second party being present on the stairs. The pressure from the hotel ownership to wrap up the affair was immense, as a lingering murder investigation would be bad for business, frightening away the wealthy clientele who came for peace and quiet. The police gathered the physical evidence, the gun, the few personal effects in her room, the bottle of quinine, and treated them as confirmation of their theory rather than clues to be analyzed. The investigation was a performance of justice rather than the practice of it, a bureaucratic process designed to categorize the death and move on. The coroner's inquest was scheduled quickly, the witnesses summoned to give their statements, which were largely focused on her erratic behavior and her apparent depression, reinforcing the suicide hypothesis. The lack of rigorous police work left gaping holes in the narrative spaces where doubts and conspiracy theories would later take root and flourish. The official verdict was that Lottie Bernard died by her own hand while suffering from temporary insanity, a catch-all diagnosis that explained everything and nothing. Despite the official rush to judgment, the medical details of the autopsy provided inconsistencies that have fueled a century of debate. The bullet entered the right temple and exited the left side of the head, a trajectory that is consistent with suicide, but the nature of the wound and the position of the gun raised questions for those willing to look closer. The caliber of the weapon was large, and the recoil would have been significant, yet the gun was found relatively close to her hand, not flung away as might be expected. Furthermore, the angle of the shot required a somewhat awkward contortion of the wrist, if self-inflicted, leading some later forensic enthusiasts to suggest that the gun might have been held by someone else, someone standing close to her on the stairs. There were no powder burns noted on her face or hand in the initial reports, a detail that is often crucial in determining the distance of the shot, though the rain could have washed away such evidence. The autopsy also revealed that she was not pregnant, a rumor that had begun to circulate immediately to explain her distress and her presence at the hotel. Her body was that of a healthy young woman, physically capable of living a long life, which made the sudden violence of her death all the more tragic. The disconnect between the physical evidence and the quick verdict suggests a willful blindness on the part of the authorities, who were likely influenced by the class and gender dynamics of the time. A woman alone with a gun was a tragedy. A woman murdered at a luxury resort was a scandal, and the former was much easier to digest. The medical examination reduced Kate to a series of biological facts: height, weight, trajectory of lead, stripping away the emotional reality of her final moments and turning her into a piece of evidence that did not quite fit the puzzle. The silence of the body on the slab matched the silence of the hotel walls, neither willing to give up the full truth of what happened on that stormy night. The unraveling of the mystery began with the identification of the body, for Lottie Bernard was a ghost even before she died, a fiction created to hide a woman named Kate Morgan. The police circulated a description of the deceased, and the breakthrough came when a luggage ticket found in her possession was traced back to a trunk at the train station. This trunk contained clothing and letters that led the authorities to her true identity and to her husband, Thomas Morgan. The revelation that the mysterious beauty was a married woman estranged from her husband added a layer of domestic drama to the case that the press devoured. Kate Morgan was born in Iowa in 1864 and had led a life that was far from the stable domestic ideal of the Victorian era. She was a drifter of sorts, moving with her husband, who worked as a gambler on the trains, a profession that was precarious and often dangerous. The discovery of her identity shifted the narrative from one of a lonely spinster to one of a troubled marriage and a woman on the run. Detective work of the time relied heavily on telegrams and interviews, and the picture that emerged was of a woman who was deeply unhappy, who had perhaps sought to escape her life or to confront her husband about his infidelities. The trunk was a treasure trove of clues containing clothes that were far too fine for a woman of limited means, suggesting that she or her husband had access to money, perhaps ill-gotten. The letters found were cryptic, hinting at disputes and despair but offering no smoking gun. The transformation of Lottie into Kate grounded the ghost story in reality, giving the victim a name and a history, but it also exposed the tragedy of a woman who had tried to reinvent herself only to be dragged back into her own narrative by death. The police realized they were not dealing with a simple case of melancholia, but with the fallout of a chaotic and possibly criminal life. Kate Morgan's backstory is a tapestry of American restlessness, a reflection of a society in flux where people moved west to reinvent themselves but often found they could not outrun their demons. She married Thomas Morgan, a man whose charm was likely equaled by his irresponsibility, and their life together was a series of train rides and hotel rooms, a transient existence that lacked the anchor of a true home. Tom Morgan was a card sharp, a man who made his living preying on the gullibility of travelers, and Kate was often his accomplice, or at least a passive beneficiary of his schemes. This lifestyle took a toll on her, evidenced by her reported bouts of illness and her growing dissatisfaction with her marriage. It is believed that she had become pregnant and lost the child or was unable to conceive, a source of deep sorrow that strained the relationship further. By 1892, the marriage was failing and Kate was drifting away both physically and emotionally. Her journey to the Hotel del Coronado was likely a desperate bid to force a confrontation or a reconciliation with Tom, who was rumored to be in the area. She was a woman trapped in the social expectations of her time, where divorce was a scandal and a woman's worth was tied to her husband, yet she was living on the fringes of that society, associating with gamblers and drifters. Her psychology was that of a person cornered, having exhausted her options and her resources. The purchase of the gun was not just a reaction to the moment but a culmination of years of insecurity and fear. Kate Morgan was a victim of the Western dream, the idea that one could always move further west and find a better life, a fallacy that ended for her at the very edge of the continent where there was nowhere left to go. Her life was a series of gambles, and the trip to Coronado was the final all-in bet that she lost. The role of Thomas Morgan in the death of his wife remains the darkest shadow over the case, a source of suspicion that has never been fully dispelled. When contacted by the police, Tom Morgan was miles away, providing him with a convenient alibi, yet his reaction to the news of his wife's death was strangely muted, lacking the passionate grief one might expect. He did not come to claim the body, immediately citing lack of funds and distance, a callousness that turned public opinion against him. There were rumors of another man, a lover, whom Kate might have been meeting at the hotel, or perhaps Tom himself had come to the hotel in secret. The Lizzie letter, a note found in her possession, appeared to be a suicide note, but the handwriting was disputed, and the tone seemed staged, leading some to believe it was a forgery planted to support the suicide theory. Was Tom Morgan a man capable of murder? As a professional gambler, he was accustomed to high stakes and calculating risks, and a wife who had become a burden might have been a liability he wished to liquidate. The theory that he or an associate met Kate on the steps that night and pulled the trigger is plausible given the inconsistencies of the crime scene. Perhaps an argument ensued, a struggle for the gun, or a cold-blooded execution disguised as suicide. Tom's subsequent behavior — he destroyed many of her letters and photos — suggests a man trying to erase a history he found inconvenient. He essentially walked away from the tragedy, leaving Kate to face eternity alone, just as he had left her to face the hotel alone. The ambiguity of his involvement is the engine that keeps the mystery running, a narrative gap that allows for endless speculation about betrayal and murder. The funeral of Kate Morgan was a bleak affair, a final indignity in a life that had unraveled so publicly. Because her husband did not claim her body immediately, and because she had no local family, she was at risk of being buried in a potter's field, the final resting place for the indigent and the unwanted. However, the kindness of strangers, or perhaps the desire of the city to maintain some semblance of propriety, led to a proper burial at Mount Hope Cemetery in San Diego. The service was sparsely attended, mostly by the curious and the officials who had processed her death. There were no weeping relatives, no eulogies praising her character, only the murmuring of the minister and the sound of the dirt hitting the coffin. She was buried under the name Kate Morgan, her alias Lottie Bernard discarded like a costume she no longer needed. The isolation of her burial mirrored the isolation of her death, a solitary figure lowered into the earth far from the Iowa plains of her birth. The tragedy of the unclaimed body resonated with the public, sparking a morbid fascination that saw people visiting the grave, leaving flowers for the beautiful stranger. It was the beginning of her canonization as a tragic heroine, a figure of romance rather than reality. The stone that marks her grave today is a focal point for those drawn to her legend, a physical anchor for the ghost story, but at the time it was simply a marker of a life cut short. The funeral closed the book on the legal case, but it opened the door to the folklore, effectively planting the seed that would grow into the haunting of the Hotel del Coronado. She was put in the ground, but the hotel refused to let her go. In the wake of the tragedy, the Hotel del Coronado attempted to scrub the stain of death from its reputation, operating on the principle that the show must go on. The blood was washed from the steps, the room was cleaned and rented out again, and the orchestra continued to play in the ballroom. Management discouraged talk of the suicide, fearing it would spook the superstitious wealthy clientele, but the staff, the invisible machinery of the hotel, could not forget so easily. They were the first to whisper about the cold spots in the hallways, the flickering lights, and the inexplicable feeling of being watched. The maids who worked on the third floor were particularly on edge, claiming to see a woman in a black dress walking down the corridor only to vanish when approached. These early reports were hushed spoken in the laundry rooms and the servants' quarters, but they laid the foundation for the haunting. The hotel was trying to be a place of light and joy, but the shadow of Kate Morgan had become a permanent resident. The very architecture of the hotel, with its creaking wood and labyrinthine passages, seemed to conspire to keep her memory alive. Every draft was her breath, every settling timber was her footstep. The denial of the tragedy by the management only served to amplify the legend, as repressed trauma often manifests as ghostly symptoms. The hotel was a gilded cage, and now it had a prisoner who refused to leave. The transition from news story to ghost story happened organically, fueled by the atmosphere of the building and the human need to make sense of senseless death. Kate Morgan had checked out, but she had not left. As the decades passed, the ghost story evolved, transforming from a whispered rumor into a central pillar of the hotel's identity. In the 1920s and 30s, as spiritualism and interest in the paranormal surged, the legend of the beautiful stranger gained new traction. Guests began to request the room, specifically hoping for a thrill or an encounter with the beyond. The room number changed from 302 to 3327 due to renovations, but the specific geography of the haunting remained. Reports became more detailed. Items moving on their own, gentle touches from invisible hands, the face of a woman appearing on the television screen when it was turned off. The ghost was described not as malevolent but as sad, a lost soul stuck in a loop of waiting. Paranormal investigators came with their equipment, trying to capture evidence of Kate's presence, turning the tragedy into a pseudoscience. The hotel, realizing the commercial potential of the legend, stopped trying to hide it and began to embrace it, using the ghost as a marketing tool. They published books, sold souvenirs, and offered ghost tours, commodifying the death of Kate Morgan in a way that is both savvy and slightly ghoulish. The tragedy became folklore, the pain of a real woman diluted into a spooky anecdote for tourists. Yet beneath the commercialization, the core of the story remained the deep sadness of a woman who died alone. The evolution of the legend reflects our own changing relationship with death, from a taboo subject to be hidden to a spectacle to be consumed. Kate Morgan became a celebrity in death, achieving a fame she never found in life, but the cost was her eternal restlessness, trapped in the role of the hotel ghost. Modern investigations into the death of Kate Morgan have attempted to apply 21st-century forensics to a 19th-century crime, using digital enhancements of old photographs and psychological profiling to revisit the evidence. Cold case experts have analyzed the bullet trajectory, arguing that while suicide is possible, the angle is indeed suspicious, and the lack of gunpowder residue on her hands, if accurate, points towards murder. They have scrutinized the timeline of Thomas Morgan's movements, suggesting that he could have traveled to Coronado and back without being detected, given the lax record-keeping of the time. However, without the body, which remains exhumed, or physical evidence, the truth remains out of reach. These modern inquiries serve less to solve the case and more to highlight the inadequacies of the original investigation. They reveal how easily a woman's death could be dismissed, how quickly the narrative could be controlled by powerful interests. The room itself, room 3327, has been studied by parapsychologists who claim to record electronic voice phenomena and temperature drops, adding a layer of technological mysticism to the legend. But perhaps the most compelling evidence is not forensic but atmospheric. To walk into that room today is to feel a heaviness, a sense of compression that is hard to explain. Whether it is a ghost or merely the psychological weight of the story, the room feels occupied. The modern lens reveals that Kate Morgan was not just a ghost but a woman failed by her society, her marriage, and the legal system. The investigation continues not in police stations but in the minds of those who hear her story, keeping the file open in the court of public opinion. The legacy of the Hotel del Coronado is inextricably linked to the death of Kate Morgan, a symbiosis of architecture and tragedy that defines the place. The building stands today as a magnificent anachronism, a wooden wonder in a world of steel and glass, having survived fires, economic crashes, and the erosion of the coastline. It is a memory machine, a structure designed to trap time, and in doing so it has trapped Kate. The commercialization of her death is a critique of our culture's hunger for the macabre, where we turn real human suffering into entertainment. We buy the ghost of the Dell teddy bears and take selfies on the steps where she bled out, engaging in a ritual of forgetting the reality of her pain. Yet there is a philosophical weight to her presence. Ghosts are arguably the way a place remembers what it wants to forget. Kate Morgan serves as a reminder of the darkness that underpins the Gilded Age, the despair that often accompanies excess. She is the shadow in the corner of the ballroom, the chill in the warm California air. The hotel needs her just as she seems to need the hotel. Without her, it is just a resort. With her, it is a legend. She gives the building a soul, albeit a fractured one. The legacy is not just a ghost story but a lesson on the persistence of the past, on how the walls we build to protect us can also become our prisons. Kate Morgan is the permanent guest, the one who never checks out, ensuring that as long as the Del stands, she will be waiting. In the end, the story of Kate Morgan and the Hotel del Coronado is a narrative about the collision of a fragile human life with an indifferent monumental structure. The ocean continues to pound against the shore, erasing the footprints in the sand every day, but it cannot erase the memory of what happened on those steps. The hotel remains a beacon of luxury, a place of weddings and vacations, but beneath the laughter and the clinking of glasses, there is a frequency of sorrow that has been broadcasting for over 100 years. Kate Morgan sought escape and found only permanence, becoming part of the infrastructure she tried to use as a shelter. Her death was a moment of supreme loneliness that has paradoxically made her one of the most visited figures in California history. We are drawn to her not because we believe in ghosts but because we recognize the terrifying possibility of her fate. To be lost, to be alone, to be desperate in a beautiful place. As the sun sets over the Pacific, casting the red turrets into silhouette, one can almost imagine a figure in a black dress standing at the window looking out at the water, waiting for a ship that will never come in. The Hotel del Coronado stands as a testament to the Gilded Age, but Kate Morgan stands as a testament to the human cost of that age. She is the silence in the noise, the shadow in the light, and as long as the timber holds and the paint is fresh, she will remain the unsolved mystery at the heart of the dream. The case is closed, but the story never ends.